Hey guys, so I had a whole different newsletter plan for this week. I created an outline. I wrote basically like half of the thing. And when I sat down at my computer a couple days ago, it just didn't feel right. And I just had this feeling that something else was being called to be expressed. By what? I don't know, but I've learned in all my years to follow this intuition. So today's newsletter is all about compassion. It's about how cultivating more compassion for yourself is the key to deeper and more meaningful connections with others. And it's about how creating the space inside your mind will allow for healing and how to apply that to show up more authentically in your relationship with others. As always, you have the options to either watch it or read the newsletter in full. At the end of the newsletter, I've also included meditations, as always, this time, two of them. One is a loving kindness meditation. The other one is about the parts that we have inside our mind, which we will get to in a second. But of course, there's also journaling prompts and more inspirations that will allow you to dive deeper. Again, I deeply appreciate you being here, you reading, you listening, and you taking the time to maybe comment, share with friends, or subscribe if you find it interesting and compelling. And with that, I hope you enjoy. Happy reading or happy watching. So I love to say that my superpower is compassion. It's a phrase that I stole from one of my compassion icons, a Korean vegan, an amazing Instagram and TikTok influencer, after listening to her episode of the Ritual podcast. It was something, this phrase, that hit me so hard, that felt so true to me, that I still remember exactly where I was and what I was doing when I heard it. Compassion as a superpower. Now that's a new way of thinking about things. I have always been a deeply sensitive and empathetic person. Whether I was born like that or I had to develop it over the years of trying to understand how I could experience the connection with others that I so desperately craved, the result has been the same. I feel deeply. I understand others and their experiences deeply. And I'm often pulled into action when I see somebody else in pain. Compassion is not just a part of me, it's really the core of my being. In the pain of others, I see my own pain. In their struggles, I see my struggles. In their success, I see my own success. It's why amongst my friends, I'm always the one digging deeper, trying to understand a little bit more. I ask probing questions, listen, and sometimes offer different perspectives that might provide insight. It's what makes me a great coach, a great friend, and a great partner. But it can also be really uncomfortable on many different levels and sometimes manifest in unhealthy ways. Not only does one have the challenging emotions that come with compassion, like sadness and hurt and helplessness, which we're never really taught to manage, but also the natural instinct to try and alleviate that pain so that I no longer feel it too. And if you're a highly sensitive person like myself that doesn't learn to sit with those challenging emotions and gets too focused on helping alleviate the pain of others so that I no longer feel the pain myself, I completely forget to learn the most important foundational component of compassion, which is how to cultivate it for myself. We often forget this part of compassion, to first find it within ourselves. Compassion, though, is actually inherent to us all. If we take a look at children, for example, they are naturally compassionate, whether it's to other children, to their parents, or to other pets or animals. We're actually biologically hardwired to be compassionate. When we feel compassion, our heart rate actually slows down. We secrete the bonding hormone oxytocin, and regions of our brain linked to empathy, to caregiving, and feelings of pleasure actually light up. So being compassionate towards others is actually our natural state. But when are we ever actually taught to manage the challenging emotions that come with compassion? And more importantly, when are we taught to turn that compassion towards ourselves? When are we really taught to speak kindly to the parts of ourselves that are in pain? Because we all have parts that are in pain. The thing is, most of us never actually learn to practice true self-compassion. The internal dialogue in our mind is usually dominated by the different parts of us that have feelings of lack, of inadequacy, of jealousy, frustration, shame, and sadness. Therefore, our natural ability to be compassionate towards others is then also corrupted by the same jealousy, frustration, shame, and pride. Or we're pouring from an empty cup. So our bandwidth for compassion is only reserved for those closest to us. That means while compassion is natural, our systems are not really set up to nurture it. So I've always had an issue, actually, with the English definition of compassion because I feel like it misses some critical components. The Oxford Dictionary defines compassion as sympathetic pity and concern for the sufferings or misfortunes of others. Firstly, it inherently implies that compassion is only applied outside of ourselves. And secondly, it implies that it is simply a state of being and not an action to be taken. To me, compassion is so much more. It is both a state of being and an active practice. It is something you feel and also a catalyst for something you do. And it is something that is both individual and collective. What I love so much more is actually the etymology of the word compassion. Compassion comes from the Latin word compassio and from compati, which means to suffer with. This means that compassion literally means to suffer with. And interestingly, in German, compassion is Mitleid. Mit meaning with and Leid being very close to leiden, which is the verb to suffer. So that means that compassion is actually a collective experience in which we look at a situation and we think, I am not outside of you and your experience, but I am there with you in that space. It doesn't mean that I'm caught up in it, but I am there. There's a certain level of stability and inner strength required to simply be there and not get caught up in the chaos. And yet we're not taught to sit in that uncomfortable place of the suffering with others, much less the suffering with ourselves for too long. So it's no wonder that when we see someone else in pain, we want to immediately alleviate it and fix it, sweep it under the rug. Or we end up projecting our own stories of inadequacy onto that other person. Within ourselves, it can be sometimes even worse. We see a part of us getting upset or triggered by something and we think, oh my God, why are you getting so upset or emotional about this? I don't have time for this. Or we try to get rid of it by distracting ourselves with the great numbing tools like social media, like food, alcohol, weed, whatever your favorite vice is. We do everything we can to avoid the discomfort of someone else's or our own pain instead of doing the one thing that person or that part of us needs the most: to simply be there and to suffer with. So if we want to cultivate more compassion for others, if we want to be less triggered, less judgmental, be kinder and more loving to others, if we want to feel lighter, have more genuine connections, feel more confident in how we show up in relationships, we first must dive into the dark, mucky waters of our own mind and learn to engage and find compassion with the many characters who reside there. Now, I've mentioned a few times already in this post the idea of parts of ourselves, the many personalities that live inside our heads, like the critic for whom nothing is good enough, or the lazy part of us that can't seem to stop doom scrolling and get off the couch, or the sensitive part of us that flares up with anger when someone does something triggering. So one of my favorite concepts, actually, in psychology that has significantly resonated with me in my journey is called internal family systems by psychologist Richard Schwartz. IFS is a concept that says our minds are actually made up of many various parts, and underneath them is a person's core, our true self. Like members of a family, a person's inner parts can take on extreme roles or subpersonalities based on the past experiences that are used as survival strategies. Each part has its own perspective, its own interests, its own memories and viewpoint, even if those are not objectively correct. But one of the core tenets of IFS, however, is that every part has a positive intent, even if its actions are counterproductive or cause dysfunction. It's just about finding compassion with them to understand what that positive intent is. And if we think about it, it actually makes complete sense. There are parts of us that feel hurt, scared, lost, and unvalued. So then there are other parts that are trying to protect those vulnerable parts. This is why we get triggered by our spouse doing something that makes us feel stupid, or by our boss yelling by us, or by our children acting out, or by too much stress at work. There are parts of us that want to overeat when we feel sad, that are critical of all the work we do so that we can keep our edge, and that lash out in anger when something doesn't go the way we expect. So of course, with all of this internal soap opera going on in our heads, it's easy to project that same internal drama onto others, or to blame others for triggering those thought loops inside our heads. This is how relationships break down. This is how something so minimal gets blown out of proportion. And that's how we continue to run away from the messiness of life, as opposed to learning to simply sit with the suffering, whether it's in our own heads or the suffering of someone else. So if we want to bring more compassion into our lives for ourselves and then by extension others, we must learn to differentiate these many parts that are fighting in our heads from our core self, the part of us that is calm and peaceful, clear, and compassionate. Once we see that these parts are not us, then we can begin to build a loving, compassionate relationship with them. We can ask them what they need in order to heal and work together to have them no longer feel like they need to play the role that they are so accustomed to playing. But the thing about it is that it's not just about coming in and doing something to fix it. It's simply about going into that space with them and sitting with their suffering just as you would a friend who is in pain. It's by holding this space and not getting swept away that the healing can begin to occur. So the cool thing is when we hold ourselves in this space of love and kindness, we're able to hold others in this space of love and kindness as well. And vice versa, when we hold others in this space, we learn how to better hold ourselves as well. And herein lies the beautiful paradox of compassion. It is both a deeply selfish act and an unselfish one. The more you do it for yourself, the more you can feel it for others. And the more that you feel it for others, the more you can find it for yourself. If there is one thing that I have learned on my own healing journey, it is that compassion is so much more than just a static state of emotions I feel towards someone else. Compassion is truly a verb. It is something I must actively do if I want to feel more of it. If I want to have more love, connection, kindness, and compassion in my life, I can only get this by doing one thing: compassioning, by practicing the art of compassion. What I so often hear from others, whether it's friends or clients, is that people find it so hard to be compassionate towards others or themselves because they are afraid that if they have to sit with that suffering, that they'll get pulled into it and not be able to get out. However, if we can learn to create the space in our own minds to observe the feelings that come up from a neutral, grounded perspective from the self, we will not get pulled down into the parts that feel them. So how do I compassion with myself? Well, I try to prioritize making space for compassioning. I work to both set aside intentional time where I'm free from the numbing distractions and create daily mindful space between myself and my inner melodrama of my parts. I try to then use that space to not shy away from touching and becoming acquainted with those parts of me that are suffering. I do this through things like journaling, through meditation, or through feeling into those emotions in music and poetry and art, so I'm no longer afraid of them. I then practice compassioning with those parts. I try to work on opening my heart through things like visualization meditations and try to have a conversation with those parts to where I can hear them and listen to their needs. And I speak kind words of affirmation and non-judgment back. And then I work to extend that same love and kindness to others, knowing that the energy that I give out will also be given back. So then how do I compassion with others? Well, I have to learn to tap into the same space I have for compassion in my own mind, to then observe the suffering of others from also a neutral standpoint of non-judgment, knowing that the judgment that I have for others is far more a reflection of the judgment I have for myself. I try not to then fix, but simply be present with their experience, all while then noticing the stories or judgments or projections that come up in my own head and continue to practice the same self-compassion above in real time. I also try to notice how I am with them, what kinds of words or gestures work with them, and try to think about extending that same softness to the parts of me that I'm still working on loving. I share these experiences not to say that this is the only way, but to give you a view into the years of trial and error that I've had with reading, reflecting, journaling, and meditation. There are still parts of me that I'm working on loving, and I'm also working on being a much more grounded observer in the suffering of others. But what I've found is a much greater sense of happiness and connection. So if you're someone who carries around parts of you that are in pain or trauma or have baggage, or you're trying to find more compassion and connection in your own life and with others, I want to leave you with one little story, which is one of my favorite Hindu legends. And it goes something like this. There was once a time when all human beings were gods, but they so abused their divinity. One could also replace this with the word happiness. That Brahma, the chief god, decided to take it away from them and hide it where it could never be found. Where to hide this divinity or happiness was the question. So Brahma called a council of gods to help him decide. One said, let's bury it deep into the earth. But Brahma said, no, that's not going to work because the humans will dig into the earth to find it. Then one god said, well, okay, let's sink it to the deepest ocean. But Brahma said, no, not there. They're going to learn to dive into the ocean and find it. Then the god said, okay, well, let's take it to the top of the highest mountain and hide it there. But once again, Brahma replied, no, that won't do either, because eventually they'll climb every mountain. Then the gods gave up and said, we don't know where to hide it because it seems that there's no place on earth or in the sea that human beings will not eventually reach. Brahma sat there, thought for a long time, and he said, here's what we'll do. We will hide their divinity, their happiness, deep in the center of their own being, for humans will never think to look there. And all the gods agreed that this was the perfect hiding place, and the deed was done. And since that time, humans have been going up and down the earth, digging, diving, climbing, and exploring, searching for something that was already within themselves the whole time. So as you find your way into your own practice of compassion, remember that we must first find the space and peace with ourselves, should we want to give it to others. We can learn from the compassion shared with others to better care for ourselves. And that the key to creating more compassion in your life is not by sitting back, but it's by taking action and practicing small things each and every day. It's by simply compassioning.